Ever wonder why your data pipeline still feels exposed even with all those Microsoft Fabric features? There's more at risk than just a stray password leak. Think silent data exposure across your entire workflow. Today, let's walk through the real security gaps most admins miss and how using managed identities, Key Vault integration, and RBAC actually locks them down if you know where to look. If your organization depends on Microsoft 365 tools, you'll want to see exactly how these security moves play out in practice. The hidden risks lurking in your Fabric pipelines. Let's start with something most admins won't admit. The first time you configure a Fabric pipeline, it feels like locking things down is mostly about ticking the right permission boxes. You assign users, maybe set some workspace access, check your connectors, and move on. From the outside, that pipeline looks rock solid. It runs, it passes tests, and on paper at least, only the right people should be able to touch the data moving through it. That sense of security usually lasts right up until someone demands proof the data is secure. This is where most teams begin to realize that secure means a lot of different things, and the defaults aren't doing them any favors. Picture what this looks like in a typical Microsoft 365-driven business. Marketing wants customer order history to build a new dashboard. Finance needs raw transaction logs for reconciliation. HR expects daily syncs for payroll updates. Everything gets routed through a handful of Fabric pipelines because it's fast and supposedly locked down. Workspace permissions are set up the day the project launches and usually never touched again. But then comes the audit, maybe after a customer questions privacy practices or someone from legal starts poking around. That's when you get the uncomfortable results. A misconfigured step in the main pipeline has been silently dumping sensitive records into a shared workspace, granting every analyst in the department easy access to private customer details. It's the kind of issue that doesn't show up until you go hunting for it. In a lot of setups, the biggest risk isn't an outside attacker prying their way in. It's trusted users seeing, or worse, copying data they were never supposed to have in the first place. This is almost always the result of default settings. Fabric, like most Microsoft 365 components, inherits permissions down from workspaces to pipelines and datasets unless you go out of your way to restrict them. A workspace admin adds a new analyst to help with a quarterly report, and suddenly that person can browse sensitive ETL results or preview entire SQL tables, often without anyone realizing what changed. Now, let's get into a scenario that plays out more often than it should. The compliance officer does a sweep of production notebooks and scripts. Everything's running fine, but then a red flag, API keys and database passwords sitting in plain text, hard-coded in the middle of pre-processing logic. These secrets have been sitting there for months, maybe longer. No one noticed because the scripts were owned by an old project team or automated runbook, so they just kept working. In most cases, these keys were supposed to expire or were only meant for internal testing, but life gets busy, people leave, and the keys stick around like digital leftovers. Part of the trouble is that for most organizations, there's a line between access and least privilege, and it's written in pencil. Granting a team access to the tools they need is tidy and makes onboarding fast. But the idea of only giving people or service accounts the bare minimum rights needed for their job, that's extra effort, and it rarely survives the push to production. As a result, you get broad role assignments across workspaces, service accounts that haven't rotated passwords in years, and credentials quietly spreading across SharePoint folders and stale OneNote pages. Nobody tracks it because, truthfully, it's hard to even see where everything is. This is the very definition of a silent risk. You probably have 2 or 3 unused service principals still floating around, tied to projects that ended last year. A quick check of your Fabric workspace often reveals dozens of analysts and pipeline builders, each with more access than they actually need. With every broad assignment, every unchecked role, you widen the attack surface, often without realizing it. And the more complex your pipeline setup gets, the harder it is to remember who touched what or which accounts might still have direct access to raw data. What's particularly sobering is the research Microsoft's own security team released. Over 60% of cloud breaches come from misconfigured permissions, not from classic technical exploits. It's not some hacker brute forcing credentials or leveraging a zero-day. It's far more often someone accidentally exposing sensitive data through generous access policies. It's too easy to assume your pipelines are safe since everything's inside your cloud tenant, only to find a dormant account still has access to a data lake, or a new staff member can see code meant for senior engineers. These aren't dramatic failures, but slow, quiet leaks. You spot them, if at all, after the fact. So here's the core problem. The defaults aren't safe enough for sensitive data, and most busy teams never get around to tightening the screws. The blind spots aren't obvious until you start tracing data flow and mapping every role, every secret, every account. Suddenly, what looked locked down starts to look like Swiss cheese. The harsh reality is you're not just worrying about hackers on the outside anymore. The biggest vulnerability is the access you never bothered to check. Every setting you left untouched becomes a potential doorway. But before you start ripping out all your pipelines in a panic, it's worth asking, if these gaps show up everywhere, what does actually closing them look like? Can you strengthen your pipelines without breaking them, or is this going to slow your entire team down? Let's get into the first and easiest way to finally shrink those risk windows, cutting out passwords for good. Managed identities, killing the password problem for good. If you've spent any time wrangling data pipelines, the quiet dread of dealing with application passwords, on the surface, ditching hard-coded credentials in your Fabric pipelines should be straightforward. No more passwords floating around scripts or stashed in old config files. Just point your pipeline at the target, hit go, and relax. At least that's the dream, right? Reality is usually messier. Most pipelines pull data from more than one place, maybe Azure Skull for customer records, blob storage for historical files, and a handful of other sources for good measure. Each stop along the way usually demands a different set of credentials, and the temptation is always there. Just paste the latest secret into the code, commit, and move on. You've probably been there yourself or seen an urgent message in a channel. Hey, can someone send me the current connection string? Someone digs it up, copies it into a notebook for a half hour of troubleshooting, and then forgets it exists. That test notebook might get pushed to a cloud repo or left on a shared drive, but even if it gets deleted, the secret isn't really gone. There's a digital paper trail behind almost every password used in a rush. One misplaced credential, and suddenly your supposedly secure pipeline isn't so secure after all. The rotation game is every admin's least favorite chore. Rotate a password, break the pipeline, scramble to patch every reference, and hope nothing slips through the cracks. Multiply that grind by a dozen sources and a few dozen developers, and it's no wonder credentials end up staying the same for years. Tracking which password belongs to which service account or script? Good luck. This is how credential sprawl quietly creeps in. The more you try to keep up, the more likely you are to miss a lurking copy somewhere that could open the door for anyone persistent enough to look. This is where managed identities come in and actually move the needle. If you haven't worked with them yet, the idea is simple but powerful. Give each Fabric pipeline its own unique identity in Azure Active Directory. No more passwords in plain text or screenshots of connection strings. The identity is issued by Azure, never appears in a script, and gets rotated automatically behind the scenes. As far as your pipeline is concerned, it just asks Azure for the resources it needs, and if it has the right permissions, it gets them. If not, access is denied. You start untangling your security model the minute you switch. Here's a team scenario that will sound familiar to a lot of folks. One team inherits a set of aging ETL jobs with secrets hard-coded in multiple places, scripts, config files, even a few forgotten OneNotes. Everyone's nervous about touching them because each break might mean an emergency call at 3 a.m. They finally carve out time to enable managed identities in Fabric. Each pipeline is assigned its own managed identity, and permissions are granted only for the exact blobs and databases it needs, nothing more. Suddenly, there are no more credentials scattered across their environment. An entire series of headaches, rotating secrets, tracking what broke, remembering which file held the admin password just disappears. Setting this up in Fabric isn't a months-long project either. You choose the pipeline or resource, assign a managed identity directly in the Fabric UI, and set up access for that identity in Azure itself. That way, the pipeline can fetch data from databases, push files into storage, or call a REST API, all without you ever handing out a password. The identity is invisible to users. It just works or it doesn't based on tightly scoped permissions. And because these identities are isolated, someone on the marketing team can't quietly rerun the payroll pipeline by accident or vice versa. The big selling point here, you remove your own human error from the picture, at least as far as credential management is concerned. Microsoft's guidance is crystal clear. Managed identities should be your default for cloud resources. But adoption drags in the real world. The latest surveys show that over 40% of organizations are still relying on shared service accounts to connect cloud pipelines and data sources. That's not just an inconvenience, it's an enormous risk. Every leftover service account is an attack vector, especially if its password lives on past the original project. No system is perfectly airtight, but managed identities in Fabric do one thing exceptionally well. They keep the credentials you're most worried about far away from your users, scripts, and storage. The attack surface for pipeline breaches shrinks dramatically. There's much less to steal, and even less for someone to accidentally reveal. You can finally start thinking about access in terms of what a pipeline should be able to do, not which password is still working. Of course, managed identities won't solve everything. You'll still have those edge cases, third-party APIs, old certificates, and external services that need secrets. Fabric can't just identity map away. So after you've cleaned up the easy stuff, what do you do about the keys and connection strings that just won't disappear? That's where centralized secret management steps in. Locking down secrets with Azure Key Vault integration. Managed identities in Fabric solve a huge part of the password problem, but there's always that handful of secrets that won't just vanish. You know the type: third-party API keys, legacy systems that demand a token, even connection strings to older databases that can't be replaced with an identity. These stubborn secrets create a snag. Even when you've got your pipelines running without visible passwords, there's always that one process that needs a literal key, and you can't just throw it out. So people improvise. One team keeps a list in a locked down Excel sheet, another cuts and pastes keys between config files, and someone always has at least one connection string tucked into an email somewhere for safekeeping. It's far from ideal, but with deadlines closing in, good intentions grab the back seat. It takes just one slip for this makeshift approach to blow up. All it takes is an urgent request from an app owner or a late-night test run. Suddenly, you're emailing a secret or dumping it into a Teams chat, and before you know it, that sensitive string lands somewhere it never should. These secrets are usually tucked away in places that don't show up in security reviews, inside SharePoint folders labeled "Do Not Share" or on a notepad file saved to a personal desktop. In the rush to hit a project deadline, what starts as a temporary workaround turns into the new normal. Let's talk about Azure Key Vault and why it changes the way you actually secure these secrets. Instead of spreading credentials across 5 systems and crossing your fingers no one misplaces them, Key Vault gives you a single, centralized, access-controlled home for all your sensitive values. Every secret lives in one place, protected by Azure security controls, and every access gets logged for later review. No more chasing down which config file holds the master database password. No more digging through Slack or Teams looking for that lost API key from last quarter. With Key Vault, even the admins can't see the actual secrets unless they have a specific reason and the necessary rights. Getting Key Vault to work with Fabric is built on the foundation you laid with managed identities. The process isn't complicated, but it does ask you to be clear about what your pipeline should actually see. You give the managed identity for that pipeline get secrets rights to only the keys it genuinely needs. Suddenly, every time your pipeline runs, it pulls the relevant secret straight from Key Vault, not from a local file or a hidden parameter. No single person ever has to see the value itself. If someone tries to copy a connection string or an API key into a script, they get nothing. They have to go through Key Vault's gatekeepers. To walk through it, think about setting up a data pipeline that needs to connect to an external CRM API. You don't paste the key into your notebook or save it in a variable. Instead, you go into Key Vault, store the API key there, and give just your pipeline's managed identity the ability to read that single secret. In Fabric, you change the reference from a hard-coded value to a Key Vault call. Now, if someone audits your pipeline, they see references and access logs, but never the actual key. If the key needs to change, you do it in Key Vault. The next pipeline run grabs the new value with 0 code changes. It's easy to see the downside of not using this approach. A developer on a tight timeline leaves an API key in plain text as part of a debug message in a pipeline run log. The key ends up flagged by a monitoring system 2 days later. At that point, it's not even clear where else the key might be or who has accessed it. Cleaning up that mess usually takes more time and effort than doing secret storage right in the first place. There's also a compliance angle you can't afford to ignore anymore. Regulations like GDPR, HIPAA, or finance-specific controls expect you to show not just that you are securing secrets, but that you have an auditable process for every access. Azure Key Vault doesn't just protect secrets, it leaves a trace for every single read or update. When the compliance team comes calling, you hand them a clear log showing which identity requested each secret and when. That's not just peace of mind, it's proof you're taking data handling seriously. If you're wondering whether this really matters, Have a look at recent research. Gartner points out that centralized secret management reduces accidental exposure by up to 80%. That isn't just a potential cost saving, it's lowering the odds that your next breach will result from a mislaid password or copied API key. So now you've locked down both generic passwords and stubborn secrets. The result? Secrets become invisible by default. Even admins can't casually peek or fetch credentials without a real reason. But there's still one piece left, knowing exactly who can actually move data or execute your pipelines. That's where role-based access control goes from being another checkbox to something you use with intent. RBAC. Who really has access to your data? So if you've ever pulled up your Fabric workspace thinking you know exactly who can touch what, only to find a permissions list that reads like an old phone book, you're not alone. It always starts simply. You roll out a few data pipelines, assign your core team access, and call it a day. The plan is to fine-tune later when there's time. Fast forward 6 months and the workspace is packed with group assignments plus a bunch of developers and analysts who probably needed access just for a week. At this point, even the most careful admin would struggle to say with confidence who actually controls pipeline runs or can see raw data inside a production data set. The illusion of control fades fast the moment anyone dives into an actual audit. Let's talk about how most organizations end up here. Out of the gate, Fabric makes collaboration easy. Workspace-level roles and security groups give you broad strokes. If you're in the workspace, chances are you're picking up a whole set of permissions by default. It's quick and looks tidy in the admin panel. But broad means broad. An analyst asked to help with a report might quietly inherit edit rights to a pipeline driving daily transaction exports. Now, with a couple of clicks, someone whose job should be running queries can change the flow itself. It's the administrative equivalent of handing over your server room keys because someone needed to troubleshoot the air conditioning. Problems really show up when production collides with reality. Say you plan to keep analysts in a read-only role just reviewing deals or transactions. An urgent deadline appears and someone bumps a user up temporarily so they can fix a formatting problem in Power BI. That change never gets reversed. Weeks later, the same analyst stumbles into the pipeline editor, fiddles with settings, and accidentally sends confidential payroll data to a test storage account. It's not malice, it's the classic case of just enough access to get into trouble. Most access creep grows from these perfectly reasonable sounding exceptions that never get cleaned up. The real sticking point is the default approach to permissions in Fabric. The model is strong, there are workspace roles, pipeline level controls, and dataset specific rights, but digging into the details takes patience. The system assumes you'll go back and layer on more granular settings, but unless someone makes it their job, those granular controls just gather dust. As teams expand or pivot, the list of people with admin, contributor, or developer roles only grows. Everyone's busy, and no one wants to accidentally break a pipeline by trimming access too aggressively. The end result? Rows of users and groups with fuzzy boundaries, and a lot more people than you expected with a front row seat to your most sensitive data flows. Breaking down what makes Fabric RBAC both powerful and dangerous helps illustrate the problem better. Roles in Fabric aren't a single yes or no, they're layered. You've got everything from workspace admin to pipeline developer to dataset viewer. Each comes with its own abilities and restrictions. For example, a pipeline developer can edit, create, and run pipelines, but shouldn't necessarily have rights to change the data model itself or manage workspace-wide configurations. Data analysts, on the other hand, typically need to see reports and query results, but don't need direct access to connection secrets or control over pipeline schedules. The trouble is, in the rush to get people onboarded and keep business humming, teams often hand out contributor or admin to everybody just to avoid blocking work. The specifics get lost in the scramble. This is where things start to slip for most organizations. The audit trail tells a very different story than the permissions list. Running a Fabric Access review isn't just about who should have what, it's about discovering who actually has it. If your team hasn't looked at the access blade or the role assignments tab in a few months, you'll probably find more cross-functional overlap than you expected. It becomes clear when you look at actual changes over time. Accounts created for one project don't get removed, and temporary assignments turn into permanent ones. And while you can restrict at the pipeline or dataset level, few admins actually use those features since workspace roles feel simpler. Fabric does give you tools to see and manage all of this if you use them. Built-in reporting lets you track who's been assigned what, when changes occurred, and where new roles have quietly crept in. You can set up alerts for abnormal activities, require approvals for certain access changes, and export logs for the compliance team to pore over. This kind of monitoring gets overlooked, partly because people think reviewing permissions is someone else's job, and partly because until something breaks, there's no obvious incentive. But Microsoft's own guidance draws a clear line. Their security documentation spells out RBAC assignments should be reviewed regularly. Quarterly is the baseline, not best practice. Yet the reality is most teams set these up once and then walk away. It's not exactly exciting work, and pipelines that just run rarely get this level of scrutiny. But without these reviews, privilege creep is basically guaranteed. Little by little, the gap between who should access data and who actually can keeps widening. Intentional RBAC changes the whole conversation. When you actively shape who can change, view, or run each pipeline, you keep accidental data leaks to a minimum. You protect business-critical flows without getting in the way of people who simply need to analyze data. You avoid the classic pitfall of one-size-fits-all roles and stop building security on the hope nobody pokes around too much. And with these controls in place, your sensitive data is finally getting the defense it really needs, not just the illusion of it. So you've got secrets locked down and access finally sorted into tidy boxes. What does all this mean for how your business operates, and does it actually make compliance easier or just add more paperwork? It's one thing to lock every door, but something else entirely to prove you did it right when the auditors show up. Plugging gaps in your pipelines is necessary, but that's not where the real value is. Reliable security means your data teams move faster, legal sleeps a bit easier, and leadership stops worrying about the next surprise audit. You aren't just dodging breaches, you're showing your entire organization that trusted data flows are possible when you move beyond the defaults. If keeping your name out of those breach reports matters, now's the time to actually take responsibility and treat pipeline security as a core part of your stack. Want solid practical takes on Microsoft 365 and Fabric? Hit subscribe for what's actually working.